I found an article in a March 1935 newspaper concerning engine noises determine speed, the title of the article. In the article, it's claimed that a local mechanic claims that the government's wasting a lot of money on speed limit signs because the car's speed is not regulated by the signs, but by the noises the engine makes. And he says here that, and he's right. I'm speaking from experience of owning a 31 Chrysler that fit this example perfectly. But he says that engine noises arise from many and varied parts in the engine that rub together or are forced together by the explosion of the gasoline, become worn, and the space between the mating parts becomes too large. It may have been that way from the factory because the tolerances of the machines that made the motors in those days was huge compared to the nanometers that are possible today. So that the parts themselves may have been on the upper and lower tolerances when they were put together and permitted an excessive amount of gap between the parts. Or they may have been too tight and were damaged right off the assembly line. The unknown damage then, of course, soon became apparent out on the highway. But anyway, there's a tremendous amount of pressure and violence inside of an engine. The gasoline is compressed at 12, or well, in those days, probably 6 or 7 times atmospheric pressure, and then exploded with a spark. So the reaction is pretty violent, and it drives down a piston and connecting rod and turns the crankshaft, which eventually turns the rear wheels. The other serious issue with engines in those days was the quality of the lubricating oil. My old Chrysler didn't have any filters at all, either on the oil or the air intake. And so when it was driven on a dusty road, which was almost all the time, that dust boiled up off the road and into the air and was sucked into the engine. And all that abrasive material, of course, was very detrimental to the engine. Gulf Oil advertised 1,000-mile oil, a very long-range oil. But the problem wasn't that as much as just plain dirt that contaminated the oil, and it needed changed much more often than that. But this ad is kind of amusing. Some of those cars required 60 weight oil to take out the clearances and the engine parts. All contributed to the crescendo of noise coming from under the hood. But the Duke driver could determine which were the most serious and hunt for the sweet spot that permitted the engine to run as quietly as possible. I'm not exaggerating at all when I'm saying this. This was just a fact of life. And these engine noises started not long after the factory put them together. And an engine with 30,000 miles was a total mess if it was still running. The noises coming from an old engine were could be frightening to the uninitiated. Smoking tailpipe was an indication of bad sealing on the rings or the valve leaking oil into the cylinders, and so it was a sign that engine repairs were needed. Of course, the volume of blue smoke was also a factor. Since most of the old engines smoked, the degree of smoke was the measuring criteria. If you were the normal driver, I would say, you knew where your sweet spot was. Maybe it was 52 miles an hour. Perhaps it was 61 or something. But there was a definite speed at which the motor seemed to labor less and be less threatening to life and limb. So if you reached that speed and maintained it, a pretty seriously worn engine could last a reasonably long time. It's when you started abusing, going too fast, and that bad things happened to good people. So the theory that this mechanic had about wasting money on speed limit signs had a lot of basis in fact, because you really were bound by a law that was far more close to home than a speed limit sign if you expected to reach your destination. And of course, tires in those days too were even into the 60s. If you had 20,000 miles on a set of tires, you were lucky. They were worn out in the 60s. Now, just think about how bad it was in the 30s. If you had 1 or 2,000, the cords could be showing. And if you see old photographs of Model A Fords or cars in the 30s and 20s, almost inevitably you'll see tires with cords showing, which was the cotton thread that bound the carcass of the tire together. It was really a big issue because not only did they wear out quickly, but they were constantly flat. I mean, you barely go anywhere without getting a flat tire. And fixing a tire had to be done by you on the road, unless you were fortunate enough to be at a gas station where somebody else could do it. But there wasn't any road service, so if it got fixed, you're the one that did it. And the drop center design, which is what all cars have today, really simplified the design of the wheel. Before that, the wheel was simply a wheel that was on an axle, and the tire was an assembly that came off of the outer edge or outer circumference of the wheel, and that assembly was held by clamps that held the tire and its own rim in place on the wheel. So when you got a flat, you had to take those clamps off and pull the tire assembly off the wheel. Then you had to unlatch the rim that was on the inside of the tire, and this rim was made out of high tensile spring-like steel, and a tough thing to get off those tires. Of course, then once you did that, you could pull the tube out of it. They all had inner tubes, and then you had to pump some air into the tube to find a hole. Normally, that's the way you did, although sometimes you could find the tear or the nail or whatever it was, but most of the time it took little effort to find a hole. Then when you did that, you had to go through a process of applying a patch, and this was pretty nasty to do when it was raining or windy or snowy. But what you had to do is scrape the tube clean with a little scraper that came with this tire patch kit. Then you put some glue on it, and a lot of people just flicked a match to it and lit the glue and burned it off, but that was tricky too, because if you didn't extinguish the flame in time, it could damage the rubber, and then you're really in trouble. So, but the other way was just to let the glue dry to a point where it was tacky, and then you got a little patch of rubber out of the tire patch kit and peeled the backing off of it, and you'd put some glue on that too and wait till they both dried to it, almost tack-free dryness, and then put them together and then press on it and make sure it was well squeezed against the tube. Then you reverse that process, and then you had to pump it up, pump the tire by hand with a hand pump, and that was a job. My dad told me one time he had a tire pump that would pump a pound a stroke. Well, most tire pumps would pump, lucky to get half that, so at 60 pounds, that meant 120 strokes, or some even more, before it would fill up. And it was so common. Cars were stalled along the road all the time, either tires or engine or something, and giving somebody a push with your car was very common. Cars had bumpers in those days, steel bumpers, and so you carefully lined up your bumpers, and sometimes they didn't line up very well, and one would jump over the other and cause damage, but most of the time the bumpers worked well enough so you could give another guy a push if that's what he needed to get on his way. And on unpaved roads, it was not an uncommon sight to see a neighbor or somebody stuck in the ditch or in the mud or unable to climb a muddy hill. And so the common action then was to get out and help push the car. And these pictures show that if there was more than one car stuck, and then everybody got out. Even women got out and helped push, as this one picture shows. But in one way or another, pushing a car was a pretty common and helping your neighbor gesture that you can do if your car was still mobile. I want to talk about the old flivvers that we had over the years. Now, of course, I've already mentioned the Model T that Dad had, and that he bought in 1914, brand new. O. Henry Ford designed a clever and innovative transmission for that car, and it used planetary gears with brakes to stop the various planetary gear clusters. The lining of the brakes in the transmission were wooden, made out of wood curved around a drum. And of course it all ran in oil, so the wood had a cooling medium of the oil to keep it from catching on fire when it was under friction. And it worked very well. It needed repaired or replaced periodically, but that wasn't a big job. Henry had designed transmissions so those could be replaced conveniently and reasonably priced. You can still buy those parts on eBay or the internet. And a set of brake bands for that old car cost about $100 now, but in those days they were considerably less. The transmission and design of the old Model T was unique in the automobile industry. And he made about 15 million Model Ts, but when the Model A design came out in the late 20s, he changed it to more standard procedures as far as gear shifting is concerned. And all the other automobile companies used the same identical system to change gears except for the Model T. But anyway, there was quite a little procedure to get this old car on the road and moving down the highway. I'd just like to go through the routine that was necessary to start the car from scratch. So the first thing you did was get in and insert the key into the ignition and rotate it to the left, which put the electrical system in the battery mode. It couldn't start without a battery. But after it got running, then you switched to the magneto side. Then you turned your attention to the steering wheel. There were two levers on the steering wheel. One was the spark retard and the other one was the throttle setting. You would move the spark retard lever all the way to the top, as far up as it would go. And this retarded the spark so that the engine would not fire prematurely before top dead center of the piston. If there was a firing before the piston reached the top of its stroke, that firing could reverse the direction of the engine and force the piston back down. And if you were in the process of cranking, it would cause the crank to reverse suddenly, and the handle of the crank would strike your arm or your thumb, and it did serious damage. It would certainly break bones and do unwanted activity on your arm. So it was very critical that the spark be retarded to its maximum position. And if you did that, then there was no danger of injury during the cranking process. One thing that you dare not forget. Then you set the throttle lever to about 2/3 of its opening. So then you got out and you went around to the front of the car and you engaged the crank by simply grasping the crank in the palm of your hand with your thumb behind the crank. If it backfired, the crank couldn't snag your thumb, and well, let's put it this way: the damage to your arm would be considerably less. Anyway, assuming you were smart enough to follow the directions or read the directions before you tried to start it, you engaged the latch of the crank to the engine, and you pulled it slowly around until you got a good firm pressure against the crank, and then you gave the crank a quick jerk, and it started pretty well. Usually, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 cranks to do it, but those old engines started reasonably well, assuming they were in reasonably decent condition too. But anyway, once it started, it of course ran very rough with the spark retarded as well as far as it was. So the first thing you did was then you ran around to the side of the car and jumped up on the running board and reached in and advanced the spark, and that would let the engine then settle down to a running speed. Well, then you crawled in. Some of the old Model Ts didn't have a door on the driver's side, so the driver had to crawl over the side of where the door would be to sit down. But and I have no idea why he didn't put the door on that side on a lot of the cars. But in any case, you had to be pretty agile to drive one of these anyway, so that wasn't a big issue. But once you left the car warm up, you left the engine run, and you adjusted the throttle and the choke and the spark and all that, you learned how to do it, and you could tell by the sound of the engine what you were doing at the speed that the engine liked. But anyway, once the engine got warmed up, you would then start engaging the gearing. At the left of the driver was a lever that came up out of the floor. That lever had 3 positions, and while you were starting the car and it was motionless, that lever was pulled in the number 1 position, which was all the way back. That locked the transmission into neutral and locked the gears so that the car couldn't move. So when you got ready to launch into a motion here, you moved the lever to the middle position and you depressed the left pedal. It was 1 of 3 on the floorboard. So you depress that pedal, and when you depress it, it engaged low gear and the car would start to. And after you reached a speed of perhaps 5 miles an hour or whatever speed was necessary, if you're going up a hill, obviously you held the pedal in low gear longer to give the engine enough torque to keep moving. So you had to use your judgment on this, but when you were ready to go into a higher gear, you moved the lever into its number 1 position all the way forward and leave off the floor pedal, and that would shift it into high gear, and then you'd be it had 2 speeds only, so then the car would chug along at perhaps 40 miles an hour at the top speed, something like that. Depend on the roads, of course, and other factors. So if you came to a stop, then you pushed on the right pedal, and that was the brake, and it would stop the car. To reverse, you pushed on the middle pedal, and of course, as long as you held the pedal down, the car would back up at a given speed. It was a rather simple process, but there were a lot of steps to go through in order to make everything work. I had a friend whose father bought a Model T back in the 20s, and he bought it in Clearfield, and he drove it home all 17 or 20 miles, and he was pulling it into the barn, and he got up into the barn, and for some reason he decided he wanted to back up or something. I don't know. Of course, I don't know what his thinking was, but in any case, he got twisted up on his pedals, and he pushed the left pedal, which drove it forward, and he drove through the end of the barn and landed down in the barnyard, which is about 20 feet below the barn floor, and went through the barnyard fence and down into the field before the old car stopped. And that was the last time he ever drove it. It sat in the barn for a long time, and then I guess they sold it. But it was a little different, a little tricky. Clever though, very clever, unique design, and simple. Everything about the old Model T was simple, and the Model A too. They were very basic cars, and the fuel tank on the Model T was under the seat, and it flowed by gravity to the carburetor that was hanging down low on the engine. The Model A's had the gas tank above the driver's legs and feet and just ahead of the windshield. So the driver looked over the gas tank as he drove down the highway, and it was gravity fed too, so that eliminated the need of a pump and the complications involved with all of that. Eventually, though, Henry did put a starter and a generator on his cars so that people didn't have to crank. Although cars were supplied with cranks up into the late 30s. I know my dad's brand new 1936 Plymouth had a place in the grill and the crank was in the trunk, so he could crank the engine if necessary. But by 39, that was all past. Cars were more reliable in starting, and the necessity of the cranks were eliminated. But the next car that Dad had was a 26 Oakland. It was a precursor of the Pontiac. I don't remember much about that car except it was a big square thing and a continuing problem with the brakes. The brakes were operated by rods from the brake pedal over to the wheel, and sticking out of the back side of the brake hub on the wheel was an arm where this rod connected, and it acted as a pivot to actuate the brake shoes against the inside of that drum. But the fact that the arm itself was material, the steel was too soft to do that job, and the continuing pressure of the brake pedal would bend that arm. And so I remember Dad getting under there with a sledgehammer and bending that arm back where it belonged. That car really had a problem starting too, and when the weather was cold he couldn't get it started. So he traded it off for a 1929 Chevy. And this was a used one, and I don't remember when he traded it off, but it must have been in the early 30s. But nevertheless, that old car really was pretty ramshackle. In those days, the metal bodywork was nailed onto a wooden framework on the inside, made with pieces of wood joined together and glued. But rainwater and so forth would get inside of there and rot the wood. And of course, then the body was not very stable, and that old Chevy was a good example of that. When we hit a bump or something, the whole body would shift to and fro and sideways to some extent. I remember how it moved constantly, front to back. It didn't start too well either, but it was better than the old Oakland. But Dad drove that car then until 1937. He had it during the time I was a kid, and this picture shows that old car in the background with Ruth and I in the foreground. In those days, cars were, as I mentioned, made out of a combination of wooden frame and tin nailed to that on top of a framework that held the wheels and so forth. The framework was strong enough to withstand quite a bit of abuse and accidents, but the weak construction of the body led to pretty terrible destruction in even slow speed accidents. And most of the accidents that I'm picturing here happened at very low speeds, but the resilience of the body was so low that total destruction happened many, many times. And of course the glass itself too wasn't safety glass as it is today. In other words, it was single pane glass, basically similar to house windows, and it had no shatter-proof characteristics, and sharp shards of glass would fly in every direction when the impact happened, and the terrible lacerations and injuries that happened from flying glass, windshields and side doors, it was really pretty gruesome. Safety glass and the laminations that prevented the shattering came in the early 30s, and all the sharp corners and steel dashboards and the steering wheel fixed without any resiliency to absorb any chest impacts led to harpooning many luckless victims with the steering column. I remember when seat belts were beginning to be introduced in the 60s, and there was great resistance to using them. People didn't want to be bothered with seat belts, and it took a while for them to be universally accepted. During the 20s, most states didn't require a driver's license, although Pennsylvania did require one. But there were very few signs or signals or traffic enforcement. And of course the roads generally were filled with ruts and holes, and at speeds approaching 40 miles an hour, the combination was a recipe for a really terrific accident. By the 1920s, accidents were frequent, and many people were killed or injured every year on the roads. In 1924, there were 23,600 deaths due to accidents, and when you consider the low volume of automobiles on the highway, this is really a carnage. Not only that, but there were 700,000 injuries and more than $1 billion in property damage. In 1972, there were 55,278 killed on the highway, but the number of cars were orders of magnitude larger than they were in the 1920s. This chart shows the rate of deaths that were going on between 1913 and 2021. You'll notice that back in the 19-teens era, the rate of death per mile driven was just simply awful. And the injuries, of course, that resulted from the broken glass from windows that had no safety. And before the use of safety glass came into effect, the carnage caused by broken shards of glass was terrible. And until the 60s, seat belts weren't universally used, and the failure of the body of the car to protect the passengers was pretty obvious from these pictures. So most of these pictures shown are have resulted in fatalities. I'm going to show you a few photos that I picked up from the internet showing the terrible carnage that some cars were afflicted with after their accidents. Slop in the linkage, of course, the tie rods and all the gearbox and everything that was associated with it, but the design of the steering and the suspension of the front end didn't lead to maintaining position on a crowned road, especially. Even a flat road meant that you had to constantly adjust the steering wheel to keep the car in the right lane. There was so much slack or slop in the steering wheel that you could move it several inches, depending on how much wear was in the rest of the machinery. But you could move the steering wheel back and forth several inches and not affect the steering at all of the car. So you had to get all the linkage tightened up before the wheels would move. And by that time, they had already decided to do something else. So the front wheels were constantly moving back and forth, and it was a race to keep up with that movement and to keep the car in the right lane on the road. It was a guaranteed stay awake issue. We couldn't just sit down and let the car do its thing and fall asleep. But of course, the noise and the other issues were also a big help in keeping awake. I believe this is enough on this subject for now, and we'll go on to the next video.